for the U.S. Society for Ecological Economics webinar series. Our speaker, Erik Nordman, has kindly offered to do a presentation for us on his current work. Erik's an associate professor of natural resources management at Grand Valley State University in Michigan. He teaches courses and conducts research in natural resource policy and environmental economics, and he's on sabbatical as a visiting scholar at Indiana University's Ostrom Workshop. He's also the author of a forthcoming book about Elinor Ostrom to be published by Island Press. Thank you so much, Erik, for offering to do this for us. And before I turn it over to you, just a few technical things for people that haven't used WebEx before. So you can see if you scroll to the bottom of your screen, I think it's the same if you're on the phone, a bunch of icons will pop up. One is the microphone icon. We ask that for most of the talk, people remain muted so we don't get a lot of background noise. And if you do have a question, you can type it here in the chat box. Erik, I'll let you talk about whether you want to let people do questions as you go or wait till the end. You can also choose to share your camera or turn it off, whatever your preference is. And that chat box icon is also down there, that little circle. A speech bubble. All right, and with that, we're going to hand it over to Erik. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much for this opportunity and welcome everyone. Yeah, if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat box and I'll take a break periodically and check the chat box and see if there are any questions. We should have about 20 minutes or so at the end for questions and answer and discussion. All right, so I'm here to talk today about Elinor Ostrom's work on natural resource commons, the stuff that she won the Nobel Prize in 2009 for, and also how her ideas are being continued to be developed by others and how we can apply them to voluntary environmental programs like the 2030 district. Okay. There we go. So the conventional wisdom for much of the 20th century around environmental management was that we had two options to correct these market failures, a pollution problem or an overfishing problem. The conventional wisdom was that either you needed to privatize it and let the market handle it, or have the state impose its power and have top-down policies that restrained people from over-consuming the resource. That was the conventional wisdom for much of the 20th century, that there were these two solutions. Elinor Ostrom won the Nobel Prize for coming up with this third solution, that people and firms can collaborate, that they're not limited to just these two solutions of the market or the state, that people on their own can come together to manage their own resources. It sounds pretty simple, but it was actually quite revolutionary at the time, and it continues to be an important point going forward. So we're going to start at the beginning. I know there are a lot of students on the call today, so this might be the first time they're hearing these ideas. My parents are even on the call. Hi, Mom and Dad. So we're going to start at the beginning and go through some of that conventional wisdom, how that developed, how Ostrom's ideas kind of demonstrated that it's wrong or at least limited. And then we'll get into some new applications of her work on voluntary programs with an application in the 2030 district energy program. A lot of this work got started, well, it got started a long time ago, but it really became popular in 1968 with the publication of Garrett Hardin's article, The Tragedy of the Commons. This was published in 1968, and it's the most downloaded, most read, most requested article that Science Magazine has ever published. It is not a scientific journal article. It's not an experiment. It's an essay. And in this essay, Garrett Hardin presents this parable of a medieval village that has a common pasture. Each villager can bring animals to graze on this common pasture that's in the center, this field in the center of the village. Each patch of grass that's on the pasture gets eaten by the sheep, right? Eaten by the animals. And the villagers can bring as many animals as they want. So Hardin followed this logic and came to the conclusion that the rational herder, the rational villager, will bring more and more animals to the commons. The individual gets all the benefit from their herd of sheep. They get more wool, they get more meat, they get more milk. But the costs of grazing are shared among everybody. So when that individual villager or herder does their benefit cost analysis, they get all the benefits from adding more animals to their herd. They share the costs of adding more animals to the herd. And therefore they say, oh, it's in my self-interest to bring more animals to the herd. Now, if every person in the village follows that same logic, it's totally rational to bring more animals, but soon we're going to have too many animals on the pasture and it's going to be overgrazed and degraded. And soon it'll be ruined. Hardin says, freedom in a commons brings ruin to all. So this was a parable, a story meant to, show this lesson that if we have just freedom, unrestricted access to a common resource, like a pasture or like a fishery or a common forest, or even space resources like the moon, we're going to overuse them. Hardin used the term the tragedy of the commons in a specific way. He used tragedy in the sense of classical Greek literature. In those stories, like the story of Oedipus, Oedipus's parents, the king and queen, bring little baby Oedipus to the oracle to have his fortune told. And if you know the story of Oedipus, the oracle says this baby is going to grow up to kill his father and marry his mother, which is a terrible thing. But the oracle told the future. Now baby Oedipus is trapped to fulfill that future. And in the play, the audience learns the future right at the beginning. The interesting thing is how it unfolds. That's where the drama lies. So when Hardin talks about the tragedy of the commons, he's referring to this classical Greek sense of a tragedy where people are trapped. They're doomed to carry out their fate. In this case, when we have a common pool resource, Hardin was saying that we are doomed, we are trapped, and we're going to overgraze it. We're going to deplete the fisheries. We're going to deforest, harvest all the trees from the forest. So we're trapped. So any of these resources that have the attributes of a commons, according to Hardin, will be overused. So many resources have these attributes, and they can be broken down in having, I'm not sure, I'm just going to decline that. Something popped up here. So common pool resources are things that are hard to exclude people from using. So in the case of our pasture, anybody in the village can bring sheep to graze on the pasture. It's hard to exclude people from. And it's also, the resource is also depletable, meaning it gets used up. So if one sheep is grazing a patch of grass, another sheep can't eat that same grass. It gets used up, it's depletable. Another word for that is rival, that only one person can use the resource at a time. So there are lots of examples of commons that have been overused and degraded. Certainly there are grazing lands that have been overgrazed. Our fisheries have been overfished. We're deforesting the rainforest. In your classes, you probably talk about these types of issues a lot. So Hardin offered two solutions to avoid this tragedy, right? The people, he said, are trapped and really can't extract themselves from this. So according to him, the only solutions were either privatize the resource. So instead of having a common pasture, each villager gets their own little share of the grazing land or their own share of the forest. So you have private property, and then we don't have a commons anymore. You just have a lot of private property, and people can do with it what they want. The other solution, Hardin said, is to have top-down government intervention. Since the people are doomed and can't fix this situation themselves, you have to have the government come in from outside and impose restrictions on the resource users. All right, so top-down government intervention. Those were the two solutions that guided resource management for much of the 20th century. But was Harding correct? The tragedy of the commons framework has become the conventional wisdom on resource use all over the world. But are resource users really trapped? Are they able, do they have agency? Are they empowered to actually solve problems like this for themselves? And are privatization and government intervention really the only two solutions? So in this next part, we're going to talk about how Elinor Ostrom overcame some of these, or showed how people themselves were overcoming this tragedy of the commons and sustaining their own resource use. So with that, I'll just check the chat box to see if there are any questions. Erin, do you know if there are any questions? I'm not sure if I could see the chat box.
No questions.
No questions. Okay. So we'll move on then. Elinor Ostrom won the 2009 Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences for showing how to sustain a commons. She noted that the commons dilemma is real, that there are situations where people have overgrazed their land and overharvested their fisheries. But she found that private markets and government regulations are not the only solutions. She studied resource users all over the world and found that communities of resource users are capable of managing their own commons. And I should note that Ostrom was the first woman to win a Nobel Prize in economics. That was back in 2009. The second woman was just awarded the prize for this past year in 2019. Remember, Harding's essay, The Tragedy of the Commons, was not a scientific paper. It was an essay examining a particular perspective. Ostrom, however, did real research on common pool resources all over the world. She and her colleagues created a database of hundreds of cases of common pool resources, from her early work as a graduate student looking at groundwater management in Los Angeles, to working with Jim Atchison on lobster harvesting in Maine. She worked with other people on irrigation communities in Spain and forests in Nepal, Indiana, her home state, and other places. So she and her colleagues, which included economists, foresters, agronomists, anthropologists, all kinds of people, she was able to build these interdisciplinary teams and look at the situations, these common pool resource systems, to see what worked and what didn't. Let's take a step back and think of these resources and how we can describe them in a little bit more detail. I introduced a term before, rival. Sometimes it's the word subtractable is used, or depletable. But rival means that only one person can use the resource at a time. So some resources are rival, some are non-rival, which means that more than one person can use it at a time. Resources can also be described as being exclusive or non-exclusive, meaning that the property rights are well defined and that authorities can exclude someone from accessing the resource. So with these terms, rival, non-rival, exclusive, and non-exclusive, we can then create 4 boxes to describe a range of goods and services. Goods that are rival and exclusive, meaning only one person can use it at a time, and we can exclude people from accessing that resource. That's called a private good. Most of the stuff you buy at the store is a private good, like these loaves of bread. right? Only one person can buy the loaf of bread at a time, so it's rival and it's exclusive. The bakery owns the bread, and then you purchase it, and then you get to go home with the bread, right? So the bakery can exclude people from accessing that resource unless they pay for it. So most of the stuff that you find at the store are private goods. The market works pretty well at allocating these, and we're not going to worry too much about those. Moving to the right, we have non-rival and exclusive goods. These are called club goods. These include things like movie theaters. If you go to the movie with lots of other people, everybody can enjoy the show at the same time, right? So it's non-rival, but you have to pay to get in. It's exclusive. And if you don't pay, you don't get to watch the movie. Another example would be like premium cable television like HBO. Lots of people can watch cable TV at once, right? The signal doesn't get degraded in a meaningful way when more people watch it, but it's exclusive. If you don't pay your cable bill, they can shut off your signal. So these are called club goods. Sometimes they're called toll goods. And these are going to be important later on in today's talk. Moving down, we have non-rival and non-exclusive goods. These are called pure public goods. So these are things that don't get used up or many people can use at once. So they're non-rival, but they're also difficult to exclude people from accessing. So a good example here is public television. Now with cable TV, you have to pay to get access. But with public television, you get it over the air, so there's no problem accessing it. But they also depend on donations to fund their programming. Lots of people watch Sesame Street or Masterpiece Theater or other programs on PBS, but many of them just watch it and they don't contribute. They're not members of their public television station. So therefore, there are lots of free riders. There are people that enjoy the resource, but they're not contributing to pay for it. And since it's non-exclusive, we can't stop those non-members from enjoying the TV shows. So the free market does not allocate these effectively. You get less of that resource than would be socially optimal. And the last box is rival and non-exclusive. So these are resources that can get used up, but it's hard to exclude people from accessing that. These are our commons or common pool resources. Another related term is open access resources. So in this case, when it's rival and non-exclusive, a commons or open access, these resources tend to get overused. Right? It's rival, so lots of people are trying to get access to it before it gets used up, but it's non-exclusive. It's very difficult to exclude people from accessing it. So this is like the pasture that Hardin talked about, the Atlantic bluefin tuna fishery in the middle of the ocean. It's in international waters. It's hard to exclude people from harvesting those, but each of those bluefin tuna are highly valuable, sometimes tens of thousands of dollars for just one single fish. So there's a race to catch that fish before someone else catches it. So that leads to overfishing or overharvesting problems. So with these four terms, private goods, club goods, pure public goods, and commons or open access, we've got now this vocabulary and a framework to analyze these resources in a little more detail. So going back to Ostrom's research, she focused on institutions. And we're going to get a little jargony here. She defined institutions as the prescriptions that humans use to organize all kinds of repetitive and structured interactions. Basically, they're rules that can be either formal or informal. So these rules include things like laws and policies that might come from the government. Those would be very formal institutions, but they can also be less formal, like norms or expectations of behavior. And norms and expectations of behavior can change over time. 2 months ago, if you went to the store and you were waiting online, you would get right behind somebody to indicate that you were the next in line and someone didn't cut behind you. Today, if you go to the store, the expectation is you're going to be at least 6 feet from somebody, right? So that's a social norm that's been developed over the last month or two. It's not a law, like the police in most places aren't going to arrest you for it, but it's a social expectation that you're going to stand 6 feet from somebody for social distancing purposes to cut down on the spread of the coronavirus. So institutions in this case are the rules, formal and informal, that get created and enforced by organizations. So the picture I have here is the Valencia, Spain's water court called the Tribunal de las Aguas. This is an organization that has developed rules for managing irrigation water in the irrigation community around Valencia, and they've been doing that for more than 1,000 years. This is a long enduring common pool resource of irrigation water, and they've been very effective in creating rules and enforcing rules, both formal and informal, to manage their irrigation water. So Ostrom found that communities all over the world can manage their common pool resources if they meet certain criteria. And she found that in cases where they were successful, they followed 8 design principles. Things like having boundaries, both physical and social, around the resource, having graduated penalties for breaking some of the rules, making sure that people can participate in the rulemaking, so it's very democratic. She came up with 8 of these design principles, and most of them are related to making what was once a non-exclusive resource into one that's more exclusive. So the community itself is establishing rules about who can access the resource, how many sheep you can bring to graze on the common pasture, how many fish you can harvest, or the time of the harvest, things like that. So it makes the resource more exclusive. So that was most of her focus, was on making those commons more like a private good by making it more exclusive. What I'm going to talk about for the rest of the time is the challenge of public goods and how we can solve this free rider problem by making them more exclusive, like a club good. One of the big challenges that we're facing today is climate change and air pollution. So we want to encourage people to adopt energy efficiency and pollution reduction activities. But energy efficiency and pollution reduction have qualities of a public good. When you're using less electricity or less gasoline, using less is non-rival, right? It's the opposite of getting used up. You're actually using less. So there's no limit on how much less you can use until you get to zero. It's not, if you're using less, it doesn't affect anybody else from using less. So it's non-rival. And the benefits of pollution reduction are mostly non-exclusive. Sure, I want to breathe clean air, but most of the benefit from me driving, a low pollution car or taking my bicycle instead is enjoyed by the community. The whole community gets to benefit from that cleaner air. So those benefits are non-exclusive. So this presents a free rider problem. Firms and people will tend to underinvest in clean technology, right? Because if I invest in clean technology, that's going to cost me money, but the benefits are going to be shared amongst everyone. So this is a challenge. How do we get people to reduce pollution, engage in energy efficiency on the one hand, but also the conventional wisdom would be you have to have either private markets developed for that or have government policies impose regulations on people. But as we've seen, Elinor Ostrom showed that there is a third way. Communities can do this themselves. So Ostrom had, Elinor Ostrom and her husband, Vincent Ostrom, started a research center at Indiana University called the Workshop, the Ostrom Workshop. And they focused on looking at these institutions around natural resources and other systems. And they had a whole, generations of graduate students came through there. One of those graduate students was Aseem Prakash, who was there in the 1990s. And Matthew Potoski was another graduate student in another program at Indiana University. And they've been collaborating together for many, many years. And they developed a club theory of voluntary programs. So they're building on Ostrom's ideas about the commons, but they're applying them to this free rider problem when it comes to pure public goods. How do we get people to, and firms, to reduce pollution or take some sort of action that has broad benefits to the community, but might have some costs to that individual firm? How can we encourage more of that? So remember that club goods are non-rival and exclusive. Pure public goods are non-rival and non-exclusive. We're going to use that exclusivity to make those pure public goods more like a club good and hopefully get some benefits out of that. So in this case, the benefit of joining the club would be that you get some sort of positive externality, some sort of positive social externality like cleaner air or better working conditions. And in return for providing that positive externality, that clean air, the firm gets exclusive information or access to clients, and they get opportunities for branding and enhancing their reputations. So some of you might be watching on a computer right now that has the Energy Star logo on it, right? So that's a type of voluntary club where the electronic manufacturers take steps to make their product more efficient, and in return, they get to put on this Energy Star label on their product as a signal to the consumer that we are doing the right thing. We're a good corporate citizen. We're being responsible. We're part of this Energy Star program. You should buy our product. Right. So that's a type of voluntary club. Another example of one of these voluntary environmental clubs is the 2030 District program. The 2030 District program challenges building owners to voluntarily reduce building resource uses. This includes building energy use, building water use, and transportation-related greenhouse gases. Each building owner pledges to reduce these resource uses by 50% by 2030, and that's 50% against some benchmark. In the case of building energy use, it's a national benchmark. Water use and transportation is against a local benchmark. But this is a pretty big challenge. It's a pretty big ask for building owners to make this pledge and carry out with it. But if they're going to do that, they would need to get something in return. All right. So this 2030 District program has spread across the country. Seattle was the first one. And now 20 cities across the country have established these 2030 districts. And it is a district in the geographic sense. So the downtown portion of each of these cities is designated as the 2030 district, and the building owners, mostly commercial buildings, but also government buildings and nonprofits can participate. They are requested to join this. So I just saw a question, how did it start? This was a program developed by the American Institute of Architects, or Architecture. They developed this 2030 Challenge for Planning and then spun off the 2030 District program as an independent entity. So it started in the private sector. It's not a government program. It started as, you know, this effort from the American Institute for Architects. So we've got a lot of diversity in the cities that are participating. We've got small towns like, small college towns like Ithaca and Ann Arbor. We've got large cities like Toronto, Philadelphia, where John is right now, and Seattle. We've got hot weather cities, we've got cold weather cities. So there's a real opportunity to look at what are the different institutions, the rules that each of these 2030 districts is using to encourage building owners to participate and follow through on their commitments to reduce energy use, water use, and greenhouse gas emissions from transportation. Aseem Prakash and Matthew Potoski developed this club theory of voluntary programs. And one of the key things that they looked at is how stringent the standards were for joining the club and how rigorous their enforcement is. And they came up with these 6 labels. So along the bottom, we have programs that might not be very strict. They have very weak standards that are easy to meet, but on a continuum of enforcement. So a program that has a very weak standard and no enforcement, they call a sham. It's not a real program. It's not going to bring any sort of public benefit in pollution reduction or anything else. A program that has low standards for joining, but has some additional level of enforcement, that's called a Boy Scout program. You know, even more enforcement would be a boot camp. It has very rigorous enforcement. You can imagine like a drill sergeant yelling at you, but anybody can show up. You might get kicked out easily, but the standard, you know, for the hurdle for joining the program is very low. On the row above, we have country clubs that have very strict standards for membership, but pretty weak enforcement. In the middle, we have prep schools, which have a moderate amount of enforcement, and mandarins, which have very strict standards and greater enforcement. Now, shams in one corner there, those types of programs are not going to have a lot of public benefit. It's easy to join, but you don't have to do anything, so there's really no benefit. On the other extreme, the mandarins have very high standards for joining, and there's a very high level of monitoring and enforcement. So if you don't meet the standards, you can get kicked out. Many firms would be hesitant to join such a program. So you're going to have like the cream of the crop in mandarins, but there'll be so few firms that participate that the aggregate benefit of those sorts of programs is probably not very high. In the middle is kind of the sweet spot, the Goldilocks scenario, where the standards for joining are not too low, they're not too high, they're just right, and the level of enforcement is not too low, not too high, it's just right. So that's where you can attract the most people to join. You can encourage them to stretch their efforts a little bit to reduce pollution or improve working conditions. So things like the Boy Scouts or prep schools fall into this sweet spot of where you get the most bang for your buck. So based on some initial analysis, I found that the 2030 districts could be described as a prep school. The 50% reductions in building energy use, for example, that is a very strict standard. That's not easy to meet. It requires real investments in building infrastructure in changing the way you do your business practices. So it is a challenge. It's not something that most firms are not going to walk off the street and say, yeah, I've met this challenge. It's pretty strict. And it has a moderate level of enforcement. It's relatively new, right? The goal is to have these reductions by 2030. So while programs have been in place for 5 years or even more, we're not even halfway to 2030. So there's a lot of room going forward. The districts, while organized into a network, each district operates more or less independently. And so far, there are no standards for submitting an annual report or meeting other things. They're not kicking organizations out for failing to achieve these goals. All right, so it has a moderate level of enforcement. So I would put them in this prep school category. So out of the 20 districts that have that are existing right now, and more are popping up every day, 4 have already met the goals, the interim goals of a 20% reduction in energy use by 2020. So that's pretty encouraging that some communities are taking this seriously, and it is advancing the public benefit in terms of reducing energy, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and things like that. So I have the question there, the low-hanging fruit. So there are lots of things, if you think about your house and energy efficiency, lots of things you can do very easily, like changing out light bulbs. You've got the old incandescent bulb. When that blows out, you just take it out and replace it with an LED bulb that's much more efficient. Those are the low-hanging fruit. But once you've got all LED bulbs in your house, you're saving money. How are you going to take the next step? Well, that might be putting energy efficient windows in your house or more insulation, right? So it becomes more and more difficult to get those next incremental units of energy efficiency. So these cities that have already met their 2020 goal, and they're coming in early, they may have picked the low-hanging fruit, so it's unclear how they're going to get to those more challenging units of energy efficiency. One of the key questions is, how are we keeping people accountable in 2030 districts, right? The level of enforcement was not real high. There isn't even a requirement right now to submit an annual report or a progress report. It's all voluntary. But enforcement isn't the only option. There's a field called behavioral economics, which is looking at combining your traditional economics with psychology, and looking at how other nudges and things like that, aside from prices and money influences people, how do we influence each other through these non-monetary means? And one of those is called the behavioral contagion. I just finished reading this book, Under the Influence, by Robert Frank, who's a behavioral economist at Cornell. And he showed that, he synthesized a lot of other studies showing that smokers, for example, tend to come from families with other smokers, and they tend to hang around with other smokers. If you're not a smoker and you don't associate with other smokers, your chances of taking up smoking are relatively low, almost zero. Right? So there's a behavioral contagion, spillover effect. Other people have found that homes with visible solar panels influenced other homeowners in their neighborhoods to adopt panels. Controlling for all kinds of other influences, you find these clusters of homes that have solar panels. And the thinking is, the evidence shows that when you're walking around your neighborhood, you see one person with solar panels and you think, I've been thinking about solar panels. I don't know if it's a crazy idea or not, but when you see someone else having it in your neighborhood, say, yeah, this is something that I can do. This is socially acceptable now. I'm going to put solar panels on my house. And there's some evidence for that. Frank also talks about the Toyota Prius as one of the early hybrid cars that really caught on. And the Prius has a kind of a funky, unique design. And when you see one on the road, you know it's a Prius, even from a distance. There were some other car companies that had hybrid cars, but they looked identical to their non-hybrid cousins. So you couldn't tell if somebody was driving a hybrid Accord or the regular Accord. They looked the same. But when you see someone in your neighborhood driving a Prius, you know it's a hybrid car, and that gets you more comfortable with this idea that, yeah, driving a hybrid car is an okay thing to do. So there could be a behavioral contagion going on within the 2030 districts. When people get together at their monthly meetings and they're talking about energy efficiency and programs to, for information about how to get a grant, these things become normalized and become okay, and people start doing this, and potentially even ratcheting it up. I've talked to some leaders of 2030 districts, and there is a sense of a good-natured kind of competition for bragging rights about who's becoming more energy efficient in their buildings. So behavioral contagions may also play a role, in addition to having the enforcement mechanisms that are pretty standard. And to bring this all home, make it a little more personal, sometimes saving money saves lives. There's a program in Grand Rapids called the Grand Rapids HQ. It's a runaway and homeless youth drop-in center. They are members of the Grand Rapids, Michigan 2030 district. And by joining and making this pledge to reduce their building energy use, they get access to technical expertise and information about grants. And the money that they're saving on energy by investing in this, in energy efficiency, they're saving money on their utilities. They're able to put this money back into their programs. So that's getting like birth certificates for kids that don't have them and things like that. So the money is put back into the programs, and this is having a real impact on people's lives. So the next steps in my research are going to be using Ostrom's institutional analysis and development framework, a tool that she developed, to understand the decision-making and these institutions, the rules about how these 2030 districts operate. How do they encourage compliance among their building owners? Is there evidence of a behavioral contagion? It sounds like something that's possible, but I want to look for evidence if that's actually happening. How important are exclusive information and reputation? Is that branding effect a real motivator? And lastly, are the incentives strong enough to reach 50% reductions in building energy use, water use, and transportation greenhouse gases? Getting to 10%, 20% is relatively easy. Getting to a 50% reduction is a real challenge. So we'll have to see what kind of progress they're making. And like Erin said at the beginning, I'm on sabbatical this year and doing this original research on the 2030 districts, but at the same time writing a book about Lynn Ostrom's work on common pool resources. Each chapter in the book will focus on various case studies showing the development of her ideas and where things are going currently. She passed away in 2012, but the Ostrom Workshop is still going strong at Indiana University, and they're expanding their applications from not just natural resources like water and climate change, but also space resources, cybersecurity, information commons. So they're really branching out into new and exciting applications of her ideas. So just to wrap it up, the conventional wisdom on common pool resources was that you either needed the market or state policies to impose restrictions on people. Otherwise, they would overuse their natural resource commons. But Ostrom, through her whole career, showed that people in all kinds of communities and all kinds of settings can come together under certain conditions and collaborate and sustain their common pool resources on their own. So that wraps it up. So we've got some time for questions. And I don't know if John or Aaron want to be the moderator or how we want to do this.
Sure, I can help with that. You have a few in the chat box already, if you want to take a look at those, or I can read them out to you if that's easier.
Yeah, I don't have it open, so if you want to just...
Sure. The first one says, from Tom, says, what's the baseline year against which the 20% goal is being measured?
That's a good question. So the baseline year, each district gets to, for energy, the baseline year is in the Energy Information Administration's BECS database. So it's I think it's a 2003 database, and it's a nationwide. BECS is the Building Energy Consumption Survey. It's a nationwide survey where they divide buildings into, office building category, warehouse, restaurant. So they have a standardized baseline nationwide that you get compared to.
Great. And the next was from Anita. She asked, was it a standard for all building units or new constructions only? Which Tom actually looks like he answered. He said, theoretically, it's for all units in a district, not only new buildings. However, it's a voluntary program. So only those building operators, owners, managers who agree to participate are joining. And he mentions that you can see the list of participants district by district on the 2030 district's website.
Yes. And there are separate standards for existing buildings and new construction.
So anyone else with questions, you can either type it in the chat box and I'm happy to read it for you, or you can unmute yourself and go ahead and ask.
This is more a comment than a question. Erik, you mentioned what would drive people to fulfill the 2030 requirements. And I get a newsletter from the Philadelphia Office of Sustainability, and they publish awards. They publicize that various companies have won awards because of their efficiency. And also you can save money from it. So it seems like those two put together might be good incentives.
Definitely. And those types of awards get into that, what Prakash and Potoski talk about in terms of reputation and branding, where you're getting awards, you're in the newspaper, that enhances your reputation as a good corporate citizen. And that's, firms always like that sort of publicity.
I have a question if no one else does. Oh, here's another one. I'll read it out from Anita. More of a general thought. Are there limits to voluntary programs for achieving sustainability goals?
Are there limits? Yeah, I think the 2030 district is just, one iteration. I think there are, there's the LEED certification. That's another one in the building sector. I think there are a lot of other voluntary programs. Actually, they wrote a whole book called The Voluntary Environmentalist, and there's another one called Voluntary Programs, where they get into these. Yeah, I would say that there are limits. If you make it too strict, and the barrier to entry is really high, you're not going to get a significant amount of participation. And if the enforcement is too harsh, you also discourage people from participating. So if you're too ambitious in your programs, you're not going to get people to join. On the other hand, if you aren't ambitious enough, you're not going to achieve anything from a social perspective. So you've got to be in that middle ground, which is always changing according to what's technically feasible, what's economically feasible, what's socially acceptable. So I think that middle ground, that sweet spot is not static. It's probably shifting over time.
So we have another question from Javier. He asked, did you find some fields on Ostrom results that have not been developed as much? For instance, her proposal for addressing climate change.
Yeah, her proposal on climate change, that was something that she got interested in kind of later in life, like she did some work early on in like the early 90s, but it wasn't until like the mid 2000s, and even after she won the Nobel Prize in 2009, when she really dedicated herself to this challenge of a global commons and climate change. Another aspect of her research what I haven't talked about is it's called polycentricity, where you have decision making in different layers in a hierarchy. So when it comes to climate change, she said, I wrote this quote down just in case it came up. If we simply wait until the big guys make a decision, we are in deep trouble. So she was really skeptical of having like a top-down global solution, like a global carbon tax that would be legally binding. That's unlikely to happen, at least in the near term. So we can't just wait for global policy or one-size-fits-all global policy. We're going to have to take matters into our own hands and develop policies that are appropriate at national and subnational levels in this polycentric approach. And the Paris Agreement does, to an extent, reflect that. So the Paris Agreement on climate change says that countries should come forward with pledges to reduce emissions, and then those pledges will be compared against peer countries to see if they're ambitious enough. So the United States has we had a pledge, to reduce our emissions by 28%. We're going to be compared with Canada, with the UK, with the European Union, Japan. Kenya, for example, would be compared with some of its peer countries, Tanzania, for example. So there's not one single level of ambition that's appropriate for every country, but the idea is to come forward, review those pledges, and then over time, increase the ambition. So I got to travel to the COP25 climate summit in December. That was in Spain, and I got to see that in action. How the moderators of the meeting and other countries were trying to increase the ambition of their peer countries, even while the United States was, in the process of removing the United States from the Paris Agreement entirely and not implementing anything to meet our pledges. That brings back to the level of enforcement. How do we keep, countries accountable for following through on these pledges? That's something that remains to be seen.
Next, we have a note from Tom Stanton that it might be of interest. The U.S. Department of Energy presently has a request for interest out right now for its grid interactive efficient buildings research. He's in contact with, sorry, I scrolled the wrong way. He says, I'm in contact with 2030 districts, which have stated their interest in going after some of that funding. 42 million available for approximately 6 projects. And the DOE is seeking projects in all major climate districts in the U.S.
Tom's a good friend and collaborator, so thanks for listening, Tom, and thanks for spreading the word about that opportunity.
So next from Esther, she says, thank you for your presentation. Could you explain your methodology for applying Ostrom's framework to such a program, and how does the approach work?
So I had some slides with graphics, but I can follow up. If Esther wants to send me an email, I can follow up later. The institutional analysis and development framework is a conceptual model that embeds decision-making within the context of the biophysical attributes of the city. In this case, the 2030 district city. Is it a hot city? Is it a cold city? Is it a big city, a small city? And other attributes. And yeah, we don't have time to get into it. But if you look up the institutional analysis and development framework, that's the approach I'm using, and using qualitative data from surveys of participating firms.
Next question is from Eric. He writes, how do you think that the programs you've mentioned compare to efforts such as carbon taxes that seek to internalize social costs into the private costs that individuals and companies face? This includes price mechanisms implemented at state and regional levels.
Yeah, so I think these are really complementary. So a carbon tax, for example, would be a typical market-based solution to internalizing those external costs. Like, we can quantify how much damage a pollutant is doing to society, and then calculate what the per unit tax would be that's efficient, and then apply it. It's kind of a one-size-fits-all policy tool that can be effective. It's politically challenging to implement. So we, as an economist, lots of other economists have been talking about carbon taxes and cap and trade for carbon for a long time, and it's been really difficult to implement, especially on a national level. And like going back to that Ostrom quote of, if we're waiting for the big guys to make a decision, we're in big trouble. I'm afraid we can't for nationwide carbon tax or nationwide cap and trade. So it's good to see the eastern states engaging in RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, cap and trade, and California is working with Quebec on a carbon market. So that's an example of polycentric climate action, where you have groups that are like-minded, that are getting together to have a tax or a cap and trade. And this is, the 2030 districts, I think, are a complementary approach where like-minded business owners and cities can say, hey, we don't have to wait for the governor, to pass regulations. We can just go ahead and do this on our own, maybe, and a carbon tax would fit right into it. So I think they're complementary, not necessarily competing. But since it's voluntary, we can get going on it right away.
And Mel writes, would you discuss governmental support mechanisms that could incentivize groups to organize themselves to achieve goals such as the 2030 districts? And Tom does note below that you can email him directly for more information as well, but maybe you could address that just briefly.
Yeah, so this is a voluntary approach focusing on commercial business owners and building owners, but there is significant input from the public sector. So in all of these 2030 districts, the cities are local stakeholders. Like John said, the Philadelphia Office of Sustainability talks about this a lot. I know Philadelphia is one of the 2030 districts, and I'm pretty sure that the city government is a participant in the program. So they are kind of, in some ways, leading the way, showing that city-owned buildings are reducing electricity use and water use and things like that. There is, and Prakash and Potoski talk about this in their work, that being ahead of the curve a little bit and showing that you're a good corporate citizen can be advantageous when you come up. If you're known as a good corporate citizen and you want to expand your warehouse or build something new, you might have an easier time going through a permitting process, for example, versus a firm that has a reputation of being a terrible corporate citizen and just doing what the bare minimum is in terms of what's illegal, the legal amount of pollution. If you're a better corporate citizen, you're going to have a better reputation when it comes to going through a permitting process, for example. So that's not really a government facilitating it, but it's where the government policy and regulations kind of bump up against private action. So I think it can be helpful there.
Right, we have one last question that hopefully we can squeeze in real quick. Lizbeth writes, the management of the commons seems to require an adaptive and participative approach. What restrictions does that impose on the number of participants in a program such as the 2030 district network?
That's a really good question. And I was just reading some work by Ostrom and colleagues about what's the optimal size for a common pool resource management. And there's some debate about this, whether if you have too many participants, does it get too cumbersome? There's evidence on both sides of it. Some studies have found that smaller is better, and then when you get to a critical mass, there's just not too. Think of a Zoom meeting, right? When you have 100 people on the Zoom meeting and trying to ask questions at the same time, it would be totally unmanageable. But if you have 25, then that becomes manageable. On the other hand, there is also evidence that when you get to a large enough critical mass, you have a labor force that can tackle infrastructure projects like building irrigation canals or rice paddies and things like that. So there's evidence on both sides where in some settings, small is advantageous, in other settings, being large is advantageous. But I think it depends a lot on the physical and social dimensions of the resource system that you're studying. So there's not kind of a one size fits all. It's very idiosyncratic.
Well, thank you so much, Erik. We're out of time now. I will send a follow-up email to everyone that was here today with a link to the recording when it's ready. I've put that address right there where you'll find the recording. Erik, if you're okay with it, I'll also include your email address and maybe was it Tom's as well, so people can follow up with you with direct questions.
Yes, thank you very much. It was a pleasure talking with all of you. Be safe and stay healthy. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Erik.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye.